April 14th, 1935, was the worst day of them all. The day no Dust Bowler would forget. The day they would call Black Sunday.
Everybody tried to get out of there. Everybody was scrambling to get out to their vehicles and find their families. It looked real black as it came in, just big old rolls just coming in.
As the dark clouds approached, there was an ominous silence. Minutes later, the stillness was shattered by thousands of birds fleeing before the avalanche of dirt.
And back in the north, there's just a little bank, looked like about 8 or 10 feet high. But it had one of those headers out on each end, you know. And I did a few things there around the chickens and everything, went back in the house, and I said, Dad, we ain't gonna be able to go to church tonight. And he said, why? And that's how fast it's traveling.
My dad went into the kitchen when that dirt was blowing the hardest. The wind was really whipping. And I can remember my dad going in there and taking hold of those 2x4s. And his hands would move up and down 5 or 6 inches. This wind was whipping so hard. And I thought to myself, this thing may blow away.
When the storm hit, my father just grabbed us. I remember Daddy taking me, and he set us right with the car. And he said, stay there, don't move. Well, I wasn't about to move. And so then the neighbor man was crying, and his family was all crying. And so Daddy went over and tried to help him, and he was sticking his hanky in the radiator, you know, and putting it on his face, and he'd say, oh, God, we're going to die. He said, we're all going to die. And Daddy's finally just said, hush, you help me take care of these kids. That's when he told him, he said, you get your family in your car, and I will bumper you home.
Terrified residents tried to drive through the blinding dust. One Kansas farmer, disoriented, drove his car off the road. Searchers found him the next day, suffocated.
My dad thought that we should stop and pick up this neighbor and her baby. And it hit just about the time we were getting out of the car to go into the house. And this woman was hysterical. She thought she should maybe just go ahead and kill the baby and herself because it was the end of the world, and she didn't want to face it alone. And so my dad quoted Bible scriptures to her to prove that it was not yet time for the end of the world, that he had no idea what this was, but it was certainly not the end of the world.
After Black Sunday, others turning to the Bible found support for their worst fears. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust, they read. From heaven it shall come down upon thee, until thou be destroyed.
The spring of 1935, the wind blew 27 days and nights without quitting. And I remember that's when my mother I thought she was going to go crazy, because you got desperate. Because if the wind blew during the day or during the night and let up, you got some relief. But just day and night, 24 hours, one 24 hour after the other, but it's 27 days and nights, the spring of 1935, that didn't let up.
Living on the plains was becoming an act of sheer will. The dust was beginning to make living things sick. Animals were found dead in the fields, their stomachs coated with 2 inches of dirt. People spat up clods of dirt, sometimes 3 to 4 inches long and as big around as a pencil. An epidemic raged throughout the plains. They called it dust pneumonia. Many residents tried their own home remedies.
Skunk grease. We had a neighbor that trapped skunks, and he would save the fat and render it out, and supposedly that skunk grease, skunk oil, was penetrates your chest better, but we never liked to use it.
Mother would give us sugar with a drop of coal oil on it or a drop of turpentine, and this would clear the phlegm out of our throats.
Mom would mix kerosene and lard. And nowadays we have Crisco, but then we had lard, you know, and she would mix those together. I suppose it would have blistered if they hadn't used lard in it, but she'd rub our throats Oh, we'd be covered with it, and I hated it because it would stink so.
In 1935, 1/3 of the deaths in Ford County, Kansas, resulted from pneumonia. Children were especially vulnerable.
I guess I was sicker than I ever realized because I got delirious. I was out of my head. I can see to this day those merry-go-round horses coming out of the ceiling. You know, they're just like this, just like a merry-go-round horse goes. And I'd say, Mom, she was always there by my bed, it seemed like. I'd say, Mom, those horses are going to hit you. I said, you better move your head. And she'd move her head over. I said, boy, that one like to got you. And so I don't really know how sick I was, but I was pretty sick. I think she thought a time or two I wasn't going to make it.
I had a little brother that had pneumonia 3 times, and I've always felt it was caused from too much dirt. I remember Mother gave him his medicine in the spoon. I stayed in the room with her because we had to sit up with him all night. And she put this medicine in a spoon and put it in his mouth. And he swallowed it and laid back in her arms. Died. Excuse me. But I'll never forget how that affected my mother. She started screaming, and she just held him so tight. And even though she had several children, you know, you have people say, well, you have several children. If you lose one, it won't matter. That's not true. Because this affected Mother in a way that she was never the same again. I cried myself to sleep, I think, every night for a year because of losing him. But I think the worst thing about that was that I was the one that brought the measles home to, you know, I was in school and I took the measles and I came home with him, and if he hadn't got the measles, he might have come out of it, but they said pneumonia and measles, they never did.
By the end of 1935, with no substantial rainfall in 4 years, some residents were giving up. Dust bowlers watched as their neighbors and friends picked up and headed west in search of farm jobs in California. Having packed their meager belongings, they didn't even bother to shut the door behind them. They just drove away, their eyes fixed on the uncertain road before them.
Many of them came by the courthouse. And they'd come by to see me and say, Judge, you know, we've reached the end of our rope. We don't have anything left. We've got to get out of here. And then say to me, you know, we need a second-hand tire pretty bad. Well, of course, I always signed orders authorizing the local filling stations to give them a cheap second-hand tire, cost about $3.50, and a tank full of gasoline. And they were very pleased about it. But I'll tell you, they were gaunt, tired-looking people. I felt very sorry for them. The whole family, the wife, the kids, they were tired-looking people. People that you could see that felt rather hopeless.
Throughout the country, word spread of a mass exodus from the plains. In all, 1/4 of the population would flee the region.
We hated to see anyone leave. There were so few close neighbors or close friends or relatives, and we hated for them to leave, but we all told them to be sure and write us from California. We were all afraid we'd never see them again, you know, when everyone was leaving the Panhandle.
Lots of people left. The family west of us left, and they had kids that we played with. There was a family, 2 families east of us that left. One of the families was one where the young man died with the dust pneumonia. and they moved away.
As people abandoned the southern plains, tight-knit rural communities began to unravel. Banks and businesses failed. Schools shut their doors. Churches were boarded up. Yet even with the world crumbling around them, most Dust Bowlers chose to stay.
Dad always lived with hopes. Next year. I failed this time, but next year will be better. And I never did see him have the look of giving up or quitting. He always stayed in there and seemed that he's going to make it some way or another. If anybody made it, he'd be one of them, he thought.
No one understood the tenacity of Plains farmers better than John McCarty, the editor of the Dalhart Texan newspaper.
John McCarty was a great booster. He was always saying that one of these days the rains will come again and this land will bloom like a rose. And he was good at getting that message across.
A week after the infamous Black Sunday, McCarty created the Last Man's Club. Urging Dust Bowlers to grab a root and growl, the young editor issued a call to arms.
The Last Man's Club was one of John McCarty's efforts to build up courage in the minds of the people. And all of us who joined, I think my number was 31, we all had to sign a pledge. And the pledge read something like this. In the absence of an act of God, serious family injury, or some other emergency, I pledge to stay here as the last man and to do everything I can to help other last men remain in this country.
In states north of here, people are moving out by the thousands. Well, we're not quitting. Non-resident land is vicious land. Are we going to stay here till hell freezes over?
My father would often say, "Why would I go somewhere else? Everything I have is here, and it's gonna be better." I've heard him say so many times, "It's gonna be better."
On the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, townspeople discovered a crow's nest made entirely of barbed wire, the only material the birds could scavenge from the lifeless terrain. Anything that could was stubbornly holding on. On the parched Texas landscape, explosives expert Tex Thornton proposed a novel solution to the region's woes. Explosions, he claimed, would excite the atmosphere and induce rain. Desperate to end the drought, a group of farmers and businessmen hired Thornton, giving him $300 to buy nitroglycerin and TNT.
He advertised himself as a rainmaker, and a few of the people in town believed that it might help. I didn't think that you could make rain that way, but of course I had to admit I didn't know. And like a lot of people, I hoped maybe something good would happen, that we'd get some rain. Well, he tried 2 or 3 times. And one of the queer results about it, that just a little bit following his last try, they had quite a little bit of snow. Not very much, but it was in May, so it was quite unusual. There might have been, maybe 2 or 3 inches at the most. And he got a lot of credit for that. Some of the people who had espoused his work thought that really that we were ending the drought here, but of course that was illusory, it didn't happen.
The summer of '36 was one of the hottest ever. Hundreds of square miles of bare fields absorbed the sun's rays like fire brick in a kiln. The wind was like a blast from a huge red-hot furnace, causing my face to blister and peel off. Perhaps I was learning stoicism, but I found myself hardening to disaster.
As the drought wore on, there were some who claimed that plains farmers themselves held the key to their own survival.
We Americans have been the greatest destroyers of land of any race or people, barbaric or civilized.
Known as the father of soil conservation, Hugh Bennett was the leader of a new breed of agricultural experts. He argued that conservation techniques could restore farming to the southern plains. Bennett took his case to lawmakers on Capitol Hill. As he was about to testify, he learned that a great dust storm was heading towards the East Coast. The storm had already deposited 12 million tons of dust on Chicago, 4 pounds for each person in the city, and was poised to descend on the nation's capital. Bennett used every stalling tactic he could, managing to keep the committee in session until the dark gloom settled on Washington. "This, gentlemen," he announced, "is what I have been talking about." For the first time, Easterners smelled, breathed, and tasted the dust blowing off the southern plains. For years, before the dust storms, the federal government had regarded the soil as a limitless, indestructible resource. In a major shift, Washington now put its full weight and authority behind soil conservation. To promote the new message, the administration produced a provocative film about the causes of the Dust Bowl. Filmed near Dalhart, Texas, the filmmakers searched for a local farmer to play the part of an original settler. They found Bam White, Milt White's father.
They was wanting someone with a team and a plow to more or less demonstrate how they started breaking the plains up. So him with a team, just 2 horses, a single team, and a 1-bottom breaking plow. That way they could take and show that and have him let the plow go in the ground and start turning over sod, grassland that had never been broken up. So they come to him. And I know he put on his best hat, and he left about 8 or 8:30 that morning and got back a little after 11. And you never saw such a happy man in your life. He said, "They paid me $25 for 2 hours work." He said, "That's nearly a month's wages, and I don't see how they can afford to pay wages like that." He had no idea what it was all about, who they were, or what they was going to make of it.
High winds and sun, high winds and sun, a country without rivers and with little rain. Settler, plow at your peril.
So they had him being the guilty one to start it, of being the one that started breaking the plains out back in the early days.
100 million acres, 200 million acres, more wheat.
In 1936, the completed film was released across the country, and in Dalhart at the Mission Theater.
And then directly there, Dad went to going across the screen up there, him and old Tom and Dan's the name of the horses. There he was a plowing, here he was sitting here with me, and I was looking at him, looking there, and I couldn't figure out how they was doing that, showing him that reel, him and the horses was being shown, and here he sat here by me. So it was quite a thing, and that's the first movie I ever saw in my life.
Last year, in every summer month, 30,000 people left the Great Plains and hit the highways for the Pacific coast, the last border.
Panicked by the flood of penniless refugees heading to the West Coast, a government report warned that for its own sake, the nation cannot allow farmers to fail. In 1937, Washington began an aggressive campaign to encourage dust bowlers to adopt planting and plowing methods that conserve the soil. But getting the farmers of the southern plains to change their ways would not be easy.
They came out with a lot of these methods, but most of these old-timers wouldn't do it. You know, finally they got where they'd pay them. You know, you could make $1 an acre if you practice one of these methods. And that got a lot of them working on it because they needed that $1 an acre.
Once again, farmers ran their tractors from dawn to dark. This time, to prevent barren fields from blowing.
I felt I was becoming a slave to the land, but I held on to the thought that this land had to be stopped from blowing. Often I was so full of dust that I drove blind, unable to see even the radiator cap on my tractor or hear the roar of the engines. But I kept driving on and on, by guess and instinct. I was making my last stand in the Dust Bowl.
1938. The massive conservation crusade had reduced the amount of blowing soil by 65%. But the drought dragged on. The parched land refused to yield a decent living. The proud settlers of the plains were becoming dependent on government work projects for survival.
Dad would get up in the morning and feed the horses and harness the team, hitch them, and go to work. And work for the WPA. Drove the team. He got $1.35 a day, him, team, and wagon. And that was it. On the weekend, say on Sunday, we try to get him to play the fiddle. Well, when he's working on the WPA, hauling cleachy, his hands would be cracked from that cleachy. That alkali would just crack his hands. And he'd get that old fiddle out, and it makes tears run out to think he'd sat and play it with blood running out his fingers, just for our entertainment. You know.
Preachers teach the blessings of adversity, but I now believe too much adversity breaks a person down. Season after season, I had worked incessantly to keep my land from blowing, and no effort of mine had proved fruitful. Words are useless to describe the experience when the thin thread of faith snaps. My youth and ambition were ground into the very dust itself. I was finally ready to admit defeat.
In the spring of 1939, after the failure of 7 wheat crops in 8 years, Lawrence Svoboda abandoned his farm and fled, convinced that the Dust Bowl was creating an American Sahara. Six months later, the skies finally opened. Nearly a decade of dirt and dust was coming to an end.
When the rain came, it meant life itself. It meant a future. It meant that there would be something better ahead of you. And we as young people and sometimes parents, you'd go out in that rain and just feel that rain hit your face. It was a very emotional time when you'd get rain because it meant so much to you. You didn't have false hope anymore. You knew then that you was going to have some crops.
There'd be lightning back in the northwest. You see the flickering lightning. And Dad would say, that'll be in there about 2 o'clock in the morning. But the rains were so welcome and they smelled so good, and I could lay and listen to them pitter-patter on the side of the old house at night and really sleep, because it was a wonderful feeling.
With the return of the rain, dry fields soon overflowed with golden wheat. the harsh years of the Dust Bowl had forced farmers to accept the limits of the land. But with fortunes to be made once more on the southern plains, that wisdom would soon be tested. In western Kansas, a group of farmers gathered on the steps of the local courthouse. One was hopeful about the future. "People are thinking differently about taking care of the land," he said. "Don't fool yourself," another replied. "You can't convince me we've learned our lesson. It's just not in our blood to play a safe game."
To order Surviving the Dust Bowl on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-828-4PBS.